We are deeply honored to be joined by such a distinguished group of speakers. So without further ado, let's welcome to the stage the participants in our first discussion, Tamara Kaufman-Wittis, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute's Center for Middle East Policy, and our nation's former National Security Advisor, Ambassador Susan Rice.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Great to see you.
It is great to be here at J Street. I feel a lot of energy in the room today, and yes. And I want to thank you, Ambassador Rice, Susan, for sitting down with us.
Thank you, Tammy. Really.
You know, we've known one another for 15 years. I think this is the first time we're on a stage together.
That's right.
So thanks, J Street. Okay. I think we have to start by talking about Syria and the strikes that the U.S., Britain, and France carried out on Friday evening. President Trump's statement Friday night seemed to put some pretty clear boundaries around that U.S. military response to Bashar al-Assad's use of chemical weapons. This is a challenge and a dilemma that you also struggled with repeatedly in office. And I think one of the things I found striking listening to President Trump Friday is that he made clear that he wants to enforce the norm against the use of chemical weapons, that he and Britain and France are prepared to sustain effort to uphold that norm. But at the same time, over the weekend, we heard that he wants American troops out again. He's focused on fighting ISIS. He doesn't want to use the American military presence as any kind of leverage over Iran, over the outcome of the Civil War. Now, I know you were up at Hamilton College last week speaking with another Dr. Rice, who is another former National Security Advisor.
We had a lively discussion.
And you noted there that last year when President Trump carried out strikes, he had leverage.
We had the opportunity to employ leverage, which I can explain.
Okay.
Sure.
So here we are a year later. He's gone and carried out another round of strikes. Do you think that we have more or less leverage today than we did a year ago?
Less. But let me explain why. And why don't we start with the chemical weapons thing and then maybe talk a little bit more broadly about Syria policy in general. After Syria committed in 2013 to declare and eliminate its entire chemical weapons stockpile and shipped out 1,300 metric tons, we and others in the international community thought we had eliminated at least its declared weapons stockpile. It was evident, and by the way, when I talk about the declared weapons stockpile, we're talking primarily about nerve agents and their precursors. Chlorine is a separate challenge, but was not included in that 2013 agreement because it's an industrial chemical that's readily available and necessary everywhere. The problem with chlorine is when it is employed as a weapon of war, then it is a violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. But it became evident last year that in fact either Syria had not destroyed its entire stockpile or had reconstituted it to some extent. And I think President Trump was correct to act last year. But he did so in a very limited way, and he telegraphed immediately after the strike that he was one and done, that this was going to be very short and limited. And I think that was a missed opportunity because for all of our hand-wringing and justified concern about President Trump's temperament and how he may respond in a crisis situation, he could have played those concerns to our advantage. He could have been, had he wanted to be, demonstrably unpredictable and deliberately unpredictable, and use that to try to wrest a diplomatic opening with the Russians. The Russians and the world at that time didn't necessarily know whether this was an initial salvo or one and done. And had we left that ambiguous and tried to go immediately to leverage a diplomatic opening, I think we had an opportunity there. This time, when the Syrians use the chemicals again, I think we were right to act. I think we were right to act both in a more forceful way than we did last time, but also, importantly, in a calibrated way, because it is not in our interest to see a wider conflict. And we needed to send the message about the necessity of upholding the norm against the use of chemical weapons. But we very clearly telegraphed and very clearly now twice have demonstrated that we are not prepared to use regime-threatening force to deal with the chemical weapons challenge. And therefore, I think our leverage is even less than it might have been on chemical weapons before. The other thing we did, which I think is going to prove an interesting challenge, is to be deliberately ambiguous. You heard this from Secretary Mattis on Friday night and others, as to whether the red line is now the use of chlorine gas, which has happened many, many times over the course of this war and in the last few years, in which case we'll be striking frequently if we keep our word, or is it still the use of nerve agent, which has implicitly been the red line up until now, and we still don't have clarity on whether the attack that we were responding to in Duma was chlorine or chlorine plus.
Right.
So we've now left it to the Russians and the Syrians to guess where that red line is, and we may have put ourselves as a consequence in a bit of a difficult situation.
Because we've essentially said that if this use continues, we're going to do more. And we haven't...
It's not clear what we mean by this use.
Right.
Is it use of nerve agent or use of chlorine or both? You know, so
you don't think that this limited use of force is going to have much impact in deterring?
I think it will have limited impact. I think I think it was the right thing to do, and I think taking out, in particular, that R&D facility in Damascus is significant because there was a place where the equipment and the precursors and the knowledge was resident. But I don't think, and in fact, the Pentagon has been forthright enough to admit that they don't think that this necessarily precludes their ability to act in the future. And so I think it's a setback. I think it's hopefully a deterrent. I don't think it is necessarily a permanent deterrent, and I think it leaves ambiguous the question of how we will respond to what I expect to be the continued use of chlorine gas.
So let me ask you about the Russian role here, specifically in Syria, enabling, maybe even encouraging, use of not just carpet bombing, but chemical weapons. You tangled a lot at the UN with Vitaly Churkin, the legendary Russian ambassador, especially in the early stages of the Syrian civil war. And we were not able to get the Russians to play ball at that time with a real diplomatic process to end the war. What do you think it would take to shift the Russian position in Syria to a place where we could make progress toward ending the war?
Well, I think it's a lot more difficult now, and it was plenty difficult back in 2011, 2012, 2013, to try to make what we called the Geneva process, and you still will hear reference to that from administration spokespeople, yield a real negotiating process. The Syrians never took it seriously. The opposition, when it was at the table, was deeply divided, and Russia's never seemed committed to putting sufficient pressure on Assad to make Geneva yield something. The formula out of Geneva was that there would be a transitional national government that would replace Assad, agreed mutually by the opposition and the government. And Assad never really accepted that, and the Russians never forced him to. Now we're in an even more difficult situation to the extent that the Russians and the Iranians and Hezbollah have gone all in support of Assad. The United States' focus has been, I believe rightly, not on regime change, but on the effort to defeat ISIS inside of Syria and, of course, in Iraq. But that has made the dynamic at the negotiating table that much more difficult because through the use of force, the Syrian regime and its backers have largely suppressed what was a very divided and fraught opposition.
And the Russians now have set up their own diplomatic process in Astana, where
that's a joke. So
there's no Syrian opposition there.
Right.
There are no Arab states there.
Yeah. That's sort of Lavrov PR. So I don't put a lot of stock in that. But at some stage, they're going to be one of two scenarios. Either Assad will remain in power, the U.S. and our coalition partners, along with the Syrian democratic forces, the Kurd-led opposition elements that have helped us take Raqqa and other areas back from ISIS, will still control a substantial swath of Syrian territory in the east and the north, including some of the major oil fields. And Assad and the Russians and Iranians will have a portion of the state, the majority portion, under their control, and no help whatsoever from the outside world to rebuild Syria and enable the return of refugees. That's the scenario that we're headed towards under the status quo because there's no negotiated outcome. The alternative, and here is where I think the United States still has some leverage, is that we say, one, this portion of Syria that is de facto under the control of our allies and partners is going to remain separate and apart with the oil resources unless and until there's a negotiated outcome that meets the needs and the aspirations of the Syrian people as a whole. And by the way, you don't get the resources in the meantime. And by the way, we're staying here, which is a very important piece of this working, not only to help rebuild local governance and local institutions in these areas, but also, frankly, to prevent the Iranians from establishing a land bridge from Tehran all the way to the Mediterranean. So we have that leverage. The other leverage we have, potentially, is the promise that we and our European partners and our Gulf partners will not contribute a dime to the reconstruction of Syria unless and until there is a negotiated political dispensation that results in a government that's chosen freely by the Syrian people. And so again, at the negotiating table, we could potentially play those two cards, which then leaves Assad and the Russians with a stark choice between the rump state with no money and a viable state with international support that doesn't include Assad.
And Trump, in saying that he wants to bring American troops home, he wants to do it within 6 months or as soon as possible, is he then pulling the rug out from under that opportunity?
Yes.
What? Okay.
We'll see if that happens.
We will see.
As he says, we'll see.
So with that, let's turn to an issue that has our partners and friends in the region very, very exercised. And that, of course, is the challenge posed by Iran. Now, when the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, signed by the U.S. and its partners with the Iranians, when that came out, there was pretty universal concern on the Israeli side. But now that the deal is in place, I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of debate inside Israel about the merits of keeping it versus walking away. And yet it looks like President Trump is getting ready to walk away. We have a deadline in mid-May for the latest renewal of sanctions relief. And we're expecting him not to waive those sanctions and, in essence, put the U.S. out of compliance with the deal. So if President Trump goes ahead and pulls the trigger here, pulls the United States out of the JCPOA, it doesn't mean the deal as a whole is collapsed necessarily. But can you walk us through what you think the consequences would be for the United States, for Iran's nuclear program, and for our friends in the region?
Well, let's begin with the facts. The fact is that the deal is working. All of Iran's potential pathways to a nuclear weapon, whether uranium, plutonium, covert, otherwise, have been eliminated, verifiably so. And that is not disputed by the IAEA, nor by the U.S. intelligence community, nor by the U.S. Defense Department. And as you suggested, even the elements of the Israeli military and security services are well aware that this deal is functioning as intended. So we've gone from a situation before the deal where Iran had no intrusive inspections and verification. It was 2 to 3 months away from having the material to develop a nuclear weapon, to today, when all those pathways have been verifiably cut off, and where Iran has committed in perpetuity not to develop a nuclear weapon, and where we will have the ability for many, many years going forward to verify what Iran is up to. If we were to blow that up, and I do think that a U.S. withdrawal would in all likelihood, if not immediately, then eventually blow the deal up, because that means the reimposition of our sanctions that were lifted with respect to its nuclear program. It means that we will be completely isolated from our European partners with whom we worked to get this deal and with whom President Trump engaged in a flirtation over the last several months to try to so modify, or as he would say, improve the deal. And that has not come to pass. We've not really invested very seriously in that, and we've now got at Trump's side in Mr. Bolton and Mr. Pompeo extremely harsh critics of the deal who've sworn to its destruction. So I believe that what's going to happen is we will, in all likelihood, reimpose sanctions, hence violating our obligations. We will be at odds with our closest allies. Iran will be in a position to say quite truthfully that they upheld their obligations and the United States did not, and therefore they are not constrained by the commitments they made under the deal. That would leave them free if they chose to resume their nuclear program and to pursue it without constraint. We will have lost the very robust sanctions regime that we all worked very, very hard to put into place, that was global in its application. Whatever sanctions the U.S. may reimpose does not mean that our European partners and Iran's other trading partners will go along. In fact, one can be certain that they won't, because they were a means to an end, which was diplomacy. And then finally, we will have done this on the eve of the president's presumed discussion with Kim Jong-un, where allegedly the objective is denuclearization of North Korea, which really does have already a lot of nuclear weapons. It sends a message that the United States is inconstant, that when we sign a deal and it's ratified even by the United Nations Security Council unanimously, we're prepared to walk away on a whim, even when it's being fully implemented. So I think it's a disaster from virtually every dimension. And all it does is strengthen the hardliners in Iran, who didn't like this in the first place. And it means that the other activities that Iran is involved in that we find so reprehensible, its support for extremists, its meddling in neighboring countries, its ballistic missile program, etc., are now potentially able to be augmented by a threat and a potentially credible threat of an Iran returning to nuclear weapons research and potentially production.
So I want to focus in on that point for just a minute, because you hear a lot of critics of the JCPOA say that the sanctions relief empowered Iran in these other activities, in its regional subversion and its sponsorship of terrorism, its support for proxies. But you're saying that the danger of the JCPOA blowing up is that Iran would be able to continue those activities with the prospect of nuclear force behind them.
Quite simply, yes. And without the prospect of global sanctions being reapplied. But, I mean, don't want to take a lot of time on the history, but I would dispute the proposition that the problem with the deal is that it didn't address these other aspects of Iran's problematic behavior. It did not. It was not intended to, nor could it have done so and accomplished the objective on the nuclear weapons. Our primary interest and concern at that time, and Israel's stated primary interest and concern at the time, was to deal with the nuclear weapons threat. We accomplished that. That didn't mean that it was all said and done and we could walk away. We still have to confront and push back on Iran's very destabilizing behavior in other realms. But I would much rather be doing that against an Iran that had no potential to obtain a nuclear weapon rather than one that did.
Okay, so you tangled a lot with the Russians. You also got some things done with the Russians, including the JCPOA, including the Security Council resolutions on Libya. But since then, we've seen Russia go beyond some of its aggressive activities in Ukraine and Crimea. We've seen its intervention in Syria, of course, and we've also seen this effort to intervene in democratic politics here in the United States, across Europe, and become a kind of global leader championing the subversion of democratic politics and the reassertion of autocracy. I wonder, as somebody...
It's a good summary, Tim.
It's a brutal picture. But as National Security Advisor, your job was to look across all of these activities and figure out what's the priority. So as you look at Russian behavior today, what really worries you the most? What do you think needs to be our top priority?
Well, when you're dealing with an adversary like Russia, you've got to deal with it on multiple dimensions. You don't have the luxury of saying we're going to worry about Syria but not about Ukraine, or we're going to worry about interference in the democratic process but not about its, provocative activity in NATO airspace. We have to deal with all of these simultaneously. And that's what we endeavored to do in the Obama administration. We dealt with the risk that Russia might try to undermine the territorial integrity of our NATO partners by establishing something called the European Response Initiative, which was a very robust, multi-billion-dollar investment on behalf of the United States in conjunction with NATO to put NATO forces and augmented equipment stocks on the front lines in Eastern Europe to deter and prevent a Russian aggression of the sort that we saw in the early stages in Crimea, Little Green Men, etc. We've stepped up our efforts with NATO to deal collectively as well as unilaterally with the Russian cyber threat. We impose very substantial sanctions on Russia with our European partners in response to Russia's behavior in Ukraine and Crimea. And we worked hard, obviously without sufficient success, still to deal with Russia in the Syrian context, not only on the chemical weapons, but also in terms of trying to deconflict our efforts going against ISIS, as well as to try to revive a diplomatic resolution. We got to do all of these things simultaneously, but I think now the particular challenge is that we are a government and a leader of the West that is at best speaking with mixed messages and not leading with the constancy and robustness that our NATO partners rightly should expect. When you have a president who, on the one hand, as of the last few days, tweets critical things about Putin, but on the other hand, we learned today was very upset at the scope of the sanctions that he approved against Russia for the poisoning of the former spy in Britain. When you have President Trump pick up the phone to congratulate Vladimir Putin on his bogus election victory, and then invite him to the Oval Office and fail to mention the poisoning in Britain, we're kind of not being consistent in our messaging. And as a result, as somebody said, I think aptly, and it was quoted in the paper today, we've got 3 policies on Russia, one from Congress, one from the president, and one from the rest of the administration. And that's a challenge. We need one policy that is clear-eyed about the very real threat that Russia poses. We need to be consistent and coordinated with our allies in the application of sanctions. And I think if Russia continues, as it appears to be, with its interference in democratic processes in Europe and in the United States, then it really is time for sanctions that go beyond targeted individuals or targeted entities to more broad-based sectoral sanctions that cover areas that were not covered in the initial Ukraine sanctions.
So there's more we could do on
There's
sanctions.
more. It's not. It increases the risk and the cost. There's no question. There are reasons why. At the end of the Obama administration and throughout the Trump administration, those were not the sanctions of first resort, and they're good reasons. But I think at a certain stage we have to raise the cost sufficiently on Putin such that it affects his behavior. And we've had our intelligence chiefs testify that thus far they don't believe that's been the case.
So we're meeting at a moment here in Washington when hopes for diplomatic progress between the Israeli government and the Palestinian leadership seem really stymied. Your administration took several bites at this apple, really tried to move the ball forward, and the obstacles seem to have a lot to do with domestic politics, both for Israelis and for Palestinians. And these are issues over which the United States has less leverage. You told me at one point earlier that after the failure of the Kerry talks in 2014, that the best the United States could really try to do at that moment was to kind of mitigate the damage of a breakdown and preserve the possibilities for diplomacy and for the two-state solution going forward. Now, we had President Trump trumpeting at the beginning of his administration.
How easy it will be to get Middle East peace.
Yeah, we'll see. And saying that there's a new initiative coming. But we haven't seen so far buy-in from the region that he needs to launch something new, and we don't even know exactly what he's got in mind.
Well, we actually have no idea.
Right.
I don't think anybody else does either.
He may not even know.
Possibly.
But we have seen him recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, which of course it is. We will shortly see the U.S. Embassy open in Jerusalem. We've seen him question whether the two-state solution is in fact the goal.
Yeah.
What's the impact of these kinds of steps? Where do you think the United States stands now in its role as mediator of this conflict?
We're going to end on an optimistic note. Right?
Yes, we're going to try.
Well, I think, like many administrations before it, the Trump administration inherited an intractable problem that it seems increasingly far from potential resolution. The facts that are being created on the ground make the viability of a two-state solution more and more remote. The politics, as you said, on both sides are hostile to a two-state solution, particularly, I think, on the Israeli side at this point. And on the Palestinian side, you have had repeatedly leadership that is unable to take yes for an answer. So this is as problematic a setup as ever. And I think, frankly, the Trump administration has made a bad situation even more complicated by promising any day now a proposal that, as far as I can tell, hasn't been amply socialized with either side, but certainly not the Palestinian side, but I gather both, actually. And is highly unlikely to be the sort of balanced bridging proposal that can yield progress. I think the reaction to the Jerusalem decision, obviously on the Palestinian and the Arab side, only complicates our credibility as an honest broker, particularly when President Trump has added that now we have taken this issue off the negotiating table. So I think we are unlikely.
Can we still be the mediator in the current circumstance?
I think it's very hard. I think, under normal circumstances, we should continue to try. And if I thought that our ambassador and Jared Kushner and all these Middle East experts had the wherewithal to craft a balanced plan that, could bridge the gaps, and, I'd say we should still try. But I'm skeptical that that's likely to be the case. And in any event, I think the U.S. alone is going to be compromised without bringing in, to a greater extent than we are accustomed to and we like to, Europeans and others from the region.
So, yes, I promised you we would end on an optimistic note. And, as I think back on the range of the work you've done in a life of public service, you've dealt with a lot of intractable conflicts, a lot of devastating humanitarian crises, devastating wars. You worked through the Rwanda massacre. You worked at the UN when the permanent members were often at loggerheads. You worked through seeing Muammar Gaddafi and Bashar al-Assad turn guns on their own citizens. And yet, one of the things I think I've come away with from watching you and working alongside you is that you never give up.
Try not to, yeah.
And one of the kind of key essential qualities of effective diplomacy is persistence and creativity, right? So I'm curious, what keeps you going in those tough situations when you're just knocking heads? What is it that gives you a reason to think there is a way through? You can find a door and walk through it.
Well, I'm essentially an optimist. And I think I couldn't do the work that I've done and not fundamentally believe that the course of human history is forward and that we're making progress. And I mean, there are all kinds of reasons for that. Maybe it's my experience being born and raised as an African American woman in 1964 in this city, and seeing, through my parents who were raised in, my dad in the heart of segregation, be able to rise to the highest levels of our government and see where we have come from 1964 to the present in this country. When you look at the progress that's been made globally in reducing poverty and hunger and suffering and girls' education and the spread of democracy, even though it's obviously under threat today, the trajectory is positive. And I think, I was a student of history as an undergraduate, and I think you have to have the long view. And I believe, as often quoted, Dr. Martin Luther King's statement that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. I do believe that over time we are perfecting our imperfect selves, not just here in the United States, but mankind in general.
It doesn't bend on its own, though. We have to pull it. Right?
We have to keep working. And that's why I think the good work you all are here to do, to lend your voice to justice and peace and American leadership, is vitally important. I think we all individually have roles to play with our voice, with our vote, with our resources, to stand up firmly and together for what we believe in. And what gives me the greatest hope now, beyond my own children and the folks of their generation who truly see the world in a different and I think better way than we do, and certainly than our parents and grandparents did. Just look at the kids from Parkland, Florida, and look what they have done. I was, like many of you, I suspect, at the March for Our Lives here in Washington. Maybe you were here, maybe you were elsewhere. And I was there with my 15-year-old daughter and my husband and friends. And the power and the vision and the determination that they have demonstrated and they have galvanized across the country, their determination to not rest until our completely insane gun laws are revised, I think is incredibly important. And it gives us all a light to follow and a model for what consistent, serious, thoughtful collective action can begin to achieve. They're not done. We're not done supporting them. But they are the next generation, and they are among the many reasons that I remain an optimist. I believe in the American people.
Well, folks, thank you so much, Susan. Folks, please join me in thanking Ambassador Susan Rice for taking the time. Thank you.